More than a week of fighting in the country has led to an emergency evacuation of staff from Western embassies. Over the weekend, 1,200 British military personnel from the 16 Air Assault Brigade, the RAF and the Royal Marines were deployed in the country. The Prime Minister is convening COBRA. Hundreds of UK nationals remain stranded in the crossfire of the fighting, with limited options available for their rescue. This is the Secretary of State for International Development, Andrew Mitchell, who was speaking in the Commons a little earlier this afternoon.
She asked me about the British nationals who are trapped in Khartoum and more widely in Sudan, and I can tell her that we are looking at every single possible option for extracting them.
What are those options? Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper served 8 tours of Afghanistan, was a senior advisor to the country's Ministry of Internal Affairs, and was also involved in trying to get families to Britain following the Taliban's takeover. Very good to see you, Colonel. Thank you for coming on the programme. What options do you think reasonably exist to get some apparent 4,000 Brits out of the country?
Well, I can say from a military perspective that the joint force will be looking at every option that is feasibly possible from land, air and sea. And they will present those options to government, and it'll ultimately be up to the Prime Minister and his team in COBRA to determine what the balance of risk is that will drive which option they go for. But the military contingency planning will have been going on for many weeks, if not months.
Do you think it is reasonable? Should people expect that around 4,000 Brits manage to get out of the country?
Well, these things are always extremely complex and unpredictable, because if you travel to a country like that, you're not necessarily expected or required to inform the Foreign Office before you go. So there's always, in these kinds of, very unsettling and clearly dangerous situations, a bit of a mad scramble when suddenly you're trying to just work out who is in country. That's a challenge in and of itself. And of course, they could be spread in any number of places around the country as well. So the coordination effort here is a nightmare. And then there may well be more or less people actually that require help. But communication is going to be key. And that's certainly something that didn't necessarily go very well in Afghanistan, although the situation is different. But, it is a requirement that if there is a plan, you need to be able to communicate it clearly and deliver on it for those who are expecting and waiting for you to help them.
It seems very unlikely in one of the pieces that I was reading that laid out some of these options that British government or any government really is going to start flying helicopters into Khartoum, pick people up off buildings, given the fighting that's taking place. Perhaps more likely is building or some sort of point at a port in the east of the country from where people could be rescued should they be able to get there.
Well, I'm sure you've seen there are 3 main options: land, air or sea, and all of them are feasible depending on the situation on the ground. But the challenge is that these things are so unpredictable that even if there was an agreement between the 2 warring generals, which, dialogue is continuing both with the US, UK and others to try and influence their behaviour and create, get a ceasefire in place. But even if that is agreed, the trouble is that low-level fighters may not get that message. So I think already the French, the Qataris and Egyptians have received casualties with their extractions where they expected to have safe passage. So that's, it's unsurprising that the government is telling people to send shelter in place right now until either there's a lull or the plan that may be needed to be agreed with either partners and allies from the US or elsewhere, or the generals in place to be able to deliver it.
What similarities in terms of the British government's response rather than the military's response do you see between what's happening in Sudan and what happened in Afghanistan some year and a half ago?
Well, I'm not close enough in a government role to know quite when the indicators and warnings would have or should have caused the planning to start in Whitehall. But certainly the issue in Afghanistan, I think, has been pretty well captured in various reports, has been that lack of communication and coordination between the different government agencies that needs to work together. And then obviously with the military that would be expected and required to deliver on any plan. But, although these are non-combatant evacuation operations or NEOs, the risk is still extremely high. But thankfully, the way that we lead our troops in these sort of situations, they will be trusted and empowered to make decisions as the situation changes, but they can only go in and support when the risk appetite of the government, leads the Prime Minister or others to say go.
I was going to say that you talk about the operation, the 1,200 or so British military personnel who went in over the weekend. There's been no report of it, so we assume none of it's happened. But presumably the situation exists where British military get fired on and have to shoot back.
I mean, yeah, again, these are non-combatant evacuation operations, but that doesn't really change the situation for the young soldier on the ground.
Yeah.
You know, if fired upon, then they have to protect, you know, the lives of, or their own lives and those civilians that they are sent to extract. So, you know, it may not be that you are part of a warring group or in war per se, but absolutely the threat is as real and the risks are as real and as high. The stakes are as high, you know, even though this is, you know, certainly for us should just be an evacuation, but it's very risky.
Very good to talk to you. Really appreciate your time. Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper served 8 tours of Afghanistan, senior advisor to the country's Ministry of Internal Affairs, and as you heard there, was involved in trying to get families to Britain following the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan.